Everyone, welcome again to the Osgood Colloquium on Law, Religion, and Social Thought. This is, of course, our second talk in this new series, a series aimed at creating a community and a forum for critical thought and critical inquiry around the historical, social, philosophical issues that arise in thought about the place of religion, law, and politics in contemporary society. And it's emphatically an interdisciplinary series, and it draws, as it does today, from leaders in a variety of different disciplines. And let me just say at the outset today, just a word of thanks to Osgood, and in particular to Lawrence Austin for supporting this initiative, which is really the only one of its type in Canada. For those of you who are new to the colloquium, you'll find little sign-up sheets on each of the tables. If you're not on the Osgood faculty or graduate listserv, just feel free to sign up your name there, and we'll make sure you get announcements of new events and different sorts of announcements. Let me just recognize today as well, in addition to our visitor, the presence of another of our own great Canadian scholars of religious studies, Pamela Klassen, who is up from the University of Toronto, the director of the Religion in the Public Sphere Initiative. And so welcome very much, and welcome to all of you for coming again. We're very fortunate to have with us today one of the truly leading voices in the sociological study of religion and society, Professor Courtney Bender. Courtney Bender earned her PhD from Princeton University and is moved from there to Columbia, where she's a professor in the religious studies department. She's emerged as a very powerful voice in the study of religion, making substantial contributions really in two different registers. In the one hand, she's pushed us all in the scholarly community to theorize and think about religion and society in new ways, in creative sorts of ways, in ways that bring a new light onto questions of religious difference, pluralism, and religion and society. Alongside those theoretical contributions, Professor Bender has also urged us emphatically at each point to keep our eyes on religion on the ground, on lived religion, and has asked us to think about what religion means as a historical and a social phenomenon, working with other social movements and working within a political and social idiom. And you can find this kind of mix of the theoretical sophistication and that ethnographic subtlety in many of her works, some of which are already very much celebrated. A wonderful book that I commend to you called Heaven's Kitchen, Living Religion at God's Love We Deliver, which is a study, fascinating study, of the way in which moral and religious views influence volunteers in New York City who were working with an organization supporting those living with HIV and AIDS. A recent book in 2010 called The New Metaphysicals, Spirituality and the American Religious Imagination has already won the American Publishers Award for Professional and Scholarly Excellence, and wonderfully, the Distinguished Book Award from the American Sociological Association. She's also published a number of edited collections that have drawn scholars from many disciplines together to think critically about secularism, about pluralism, about religion and modernity. And so with her keen theoretical insight, with her characteristic sort of humane sensitivity to the realities of lived religion, Professor Bender is really making substantial contributions to how we think about religion and indeed how we think about the study of religion. And just as, if not more importantly, she's also just a wonderful person. And so we're delighted to have Courtney Bender with us today. You'll join me, please, in welcoming her.
Thank you, Ben. It really is a pleasure to be here. I love coming to Toronto and to Canada, and I have to admit also at the same time a little bit of trepidation. I feel somewhat like an interloper being a sociologist in a law school and also being an American sociologist in a Canadian law school. So you will Hear what I have to say today, I hope, in a register that is really thinking about the American context and thinking about religious pluralism in the American context, but I think with a lot of implications potentially for a much, at least in a resonant way, if not in a clearly analogical way, between what's happening in the US and elsewhere. Diversity of religion is a fact in most, if not all, contemporary societies. But what kind of fact is it? Sociologists will debate, and in fact do endlessly debate, it seems, the measures by which diversity is measured and by which religion is in fact marked. The matter of what religion is and how it is identified sociologically can be quite a challenge. What actions, what beliefs, what identities, self-given or deemed so by another kind of institution or organization, which of these are good measures for identifying religion? This challenge, this basic sociological challenge, is compounded always by the fact that most modern democracies have also so chosen to make religion a matter of private concern, one that in fact does not involve the interest of the state or its monitoring. And at the same time that states have done this, states have also claimed that the diversity of religions is a marker of their success as successful states or success as free countries. When we think about religious freedom, and indeed when we think about democracy at all, it seems that we must have measurable and identifiable religious diversity to observe. As Pamela Clausen and I have noted, along with many others, the empirical fact of religious diversity identified by sociologists, political scientists, and others is thus never disconnected from shared political and cultural understandings that claim a positive value for the multiplicity of existing religions. Or, as historian Martin Marty observes, quote, careful listening to scholars and public figures who devote themselves to this subject of religious pluralism would reveal that religious pluralism implies and involves a polity, a civic context, which provides some rules of the game, refers to an ethos, and evokes response. Religious diversity may then be a fact, but its sociological facticity shifts, and so indeed do the norms that shape it. Today, I want to call attention to and begin to consider the implications of what I think is, in fact, a pretty recent shift in our pluralist thinking. I think that for the most part, this shift to our current way of thinking has been forgotten, overlooked, effaced. Our current ways of thinking pluralistically have been so naturalized across the social sciences that I think that many of us have forgotten what has come before. And by before, I mean in the recent past, as recently as the 1950s or 60s. In that respect, calling attention to this recent shift and also thinking about why it has been so easily naturalized, this new pluralism, well, I hope help all of us pay more attention to the effects of this recent shift in pluralist thinking, as well as help us consider some alternative theoretical possibilities and roads that we have not taken. With that in mind, my talk will proceed first by marking the transformation that took place, mapping what came before and what has come in its place, focusing specifically on social scientific literature. I will then provide a few examples of its pervasiveness by noting that even the sociological literature that seeks to critique this particular pluralistic vision reasserts its basic underlying premises in, I think, problematic ways, and if not, in fact, extends them. And third, if there's time, I will highlight a few ways that this new pluralism links to some very old models of religious toleration in ways that I think that if we put those into view, we might consider troubling. And then finally, if we, again, have some time, I want to suggest briefly an alternative approach, the possibility of an interpretive road not frequently taken and that might provide a new way to consider this problematic persistence of our current visions and limits of pluralistic thinking. So I'm not going to begin with the current view of religious pluralism, but the pluralist thinking that preceded it. And this takes us, in a way, to the title that is resonant in pluralist thinking and its power, namely the 1952 bestseller, The Power of Positive Thinking, written by Protestant minister and psychologist Norman Vincent Peale. This book, some of you may have encountered it along the way, is really at least the cover, is a self-help book that suggests, nobody admits to reading it. It's one of those things, right? It's a self-help book that suggests in it a variety of habits and ways of recasting the mind to engender not just a positive outlook on life, but thereby to attract better outcomes in one's lives. The first chapter is titled, Believe in Oneself. It begins, yes, if you do believe in yourself, those C's in your classes will turn into A's. You will have better luck on the sales floor. You will attract better friends and even maybe lovers. Peale intimated that the universal laws of attraction were a spiritual and, in fact, sort of scientific reality that everyone could tap into. In fact, you didn't have to be a Christian to find yourself conforming to and benefiting from positive thinking. All Americans, all people in the world, in fact, could follow this route: Jewish, Catholic, Protestant. Peale's book was, as the chuckles around the room suggest, widely panned by religious and secular people alike. But nonetheless, it was a bestseller, and in that respect, for that reason, also features prominently as Exhibit A in Will Herberg's 1955 Protestant Catholic Jew. This sociological bestseller, and also of its time, it was sort of a popular book, provides an example of this earlier form of pluralist thinking. Mid-century American thinking about religious pluralism, Herberg argued, was largely denominational, but these denominational differences were on the wane as important markers of identity. In post-war America, increasing interactions among Protestants, Catholics, and Jews in suburban enclaves, new at the time, in schools, and again on the industrial shop floor, were shaping a new social reality where the distinctiveness of specific religious identities as meaningful social or political markers were declining, along with the power that specific religious authorities had over individuals. Intermarriage rates were on the rise. The salience of religious differences in politics and the role of the old religious cabals within urban centers were also seen to be on the wane, both in the urban centers and certainly in the suburbs as well. Yet, as Herberg noted and argued, and here's where Norman Vincent Peale comes in again, it remained the case that religious identity mattered to Americans. Being religious, but in a nominal sense and in a very private sense, was an important part of being an American. It was, in fact, an American thing to be religious and thus free. Being a citizen in a democratic society like the United States meant partaking in the religious pluralism of Protestant, Catholic, Jewish America, where religiosity was increasingly based on cheery, optimistic, and private religiosities. Herberg's analysis, or diagnosis, was a variant and an extension of classical Durkheimian and Weberian secularization theories, where pluralities of religions contributed to the declining authority and the power of traditional religions. Two aspects of classical secularization theory are particularly important to highlight here: the notions of differentiation and pluralization, which are conjoined. First, secularization theorists argued that the differentiation of different kinds of authority was a hallmark of modern society. So, whereas religion's authority had once reigned over political and economic life way back in times of yore, religion now concerned itself primarily or solely over religious aspects of life, the matters of the soul, and so on. This differentiation we see is happening throughout society, so law and economics and politics are organized in their own specific ways with their own specific ends. Religion is no different, it just becomes private. Second, and as a consequence, secularization theories argued that with the demotion of state churches and this larger power, people of different religions would increasingly come to interact with each other. Religious distinction would matter less in public life, and the coexistence of many claims to ultimate truths would eventually weaken and diminish the power and the force of all such claims. Pluralization was a sign and harbinger of secularity. In the 1950s and 1960s, it seemed to a lot of observers that this is exactly what was happening. Peter Berger's Sacred Canopy prophesied as much, as did Robert Bellah in his landmark essay on civil religion. The multiple private religious pursuits might weaken sectarianism, these sociologists argued, but nominal religiosity, nonetheless shaped by religious pluralism, was ultimately good for democratic societies. Religious freedom meant, truly, the growing capacity of individuals to choose among a variety of options, spiritual options. Today, this story of the meaning and value of pluralism has largely been consigned to the dustbin of history. It has been replaced sociologically by a story that could not be more different. This new vision of religious pluralism argues that when the state takes its hands off religious matters and religion is no longer sponsored by the state at all, then all religions find themselves in a religious marketplace. In this condition, or rather in this market, religious groups must attract and keep members if they wish to survive or thrive. And this means that many religious groups are placed in what appears to be a competitive environment. This arguably builds and increases religious vibrancy rather than diminishing it. It strengthens religious identity and limits the number of free riders one has in any religious system. And this, at the same time, creates a new identifiable religious pluralism that becomes the hallmark of a different kind of democratic vitality. Both models, as interpreted by sociologists, link religious pluralism to religious freedom. This we should be clear. But they do so in very different ways. What happened? What happened? The answer that is usually given is that things happened in the 1960s that unsettled the old narrative. Catholicism changed radically in the wake of Vatican II. New rights movements, including students' rights, women's rights, civil rights, and so on, drew on and deployed religious meaning strategically, reworked religious notions and identities and rhetoric in new ways, and as they did so, contributed to a growing place of religious discourse in the political field. In addition to these political actors, another set then followed along, more troublingly religious perhaps, fundamentalists, revolutionaries, and so on. Add to that changing global patterns of immigration spurred by new developments in transportation and communication networks, not to mention changing laws, made North America the home of Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, as well as Christianity and Judaism. People were not becoming more nominally religious at all, as predicted. Instead, there was obviously a new religious fervor breaking out all over the place. We can, and many, myself included, have taken issue with this narrative that things changed so radically in the 1960s. But this is what it appeared to be the case, at least to the sociologists of the 1960s and 1970s. Something was amiss with secularization's predictions, at least as they referred to the North American context. And so what they did is started to reassess these theories. There were, of course, a range of possible ways that they could have done so. There was nothing inevitable about the paths that were taken in the pluralization that we now understand as being normal. Yet the one they did take seemed to be a rather quick and natural fit. This model, as we can see, drew upon economic notions, and in particular economic models of the free market that were made popular by the Chicago School of Economics, famous for its arguments about the strength and necessity of free markets and the likewise necessity of limited state regulation in order to allow it to function freely. Rational economic actors, the Chicago School argues, are always better able to understand their economic situation and respond to it than the government can. The new religious pluralist model drew liberally from this view, and it is indeed striking how closely aligned our notions of free markets and free religions currently are. This model of new religious economies made these links explicit. Sociologists working in this field observed, for example, that in countries where religion was not regulated by the state, religious firms, such as the United States, religious firms were free to organize as they wished and were able to survive or thrive so long as they were able to offer their adherents the religious goods or compensators that they desired. Any new religious group could take root in this milieu. What would keep a new upstart from growing or making yet a success was only the ability of religious innovators to gain and hold adherents. This free market of religion could sustain any number of different religious groups, so long as there were enough demand. The rational economic actor was recast as the rational religious actor, who, this theory argued, would consistently seek out the religious option with the compensatory system and theology that best suited her. In this model, religious vitality and religious pluralism, marked by firms that competed for adherents, was the sine qua non of religious freedom. Religious freedom could only reach its fulcrum when individuals were free to choose, and when, therefore, there were choices available to them that were calibrated to the rising and falling demand of this new market. As Bernard Harcourt has recently written at length, the illusion of free markets embedded in the Chicago School economics models and deployed in economic policy has led to a condition in which the illusory free market is viewed as a natural economic space that should be regulated only in a limited way, and only insofar as it continues to allow free commerce. It reshapes the space of freedom and regulation in a peculiar way. In order for the market to regulate itself, only the proper economic actors, those who follow the natural laws of the market, are actually allowed to participate within it. Those who do not participate within those rules are, Harcourt argues, more than poor economic agents, or perhaps less. They are, in some respect, unnatural economic actors. Whether they refuse to act as proper self-regulating economic actors or because they cannot do so for some reason, they are nonetheless the agents for whom the state and its regulating features can play a proper role. The state can protect, rehabilitate, regulate, or penalize these other actors. Harcourt argues, in short, that one of the effects of this logic of the free market in economics is to designate some actors who are free of the need for regulation and those, on the other hand, who are not so free. Harcourt also trenchantly argues that the free market is an illusion, a position that those of us studying religion also share. We can therefore take an analogical step with Harcourt to see how this logic works with regard to religion. Religious economies models have clearly taken the American religious economy, marked as truly free since the founding of the country, as its guide. A plurality of Protestants, Methodists, Congregationalists, Baptists, or even Mormons vie for members who are voluntary participants. Losing firms are those that can't get members, but the ultimate winners are all those religious people who can maximize their religious potentials in a firm of their choosing. But outside of this frame, there really are a lot of other losers. There are the groups who are not playing the game at all, or who are not playing it very well. Jews and Catholics, slaves in the antebellum period, Native Americans, First Nations peoples. Not surprisingly, the religious economies model has a very hard time plotting these groups into their quantitative models. There are not good church records of membership for them, or membership means a different thing, or is in fact not clearly voluntary. Perhaps not surprisingly, these groups appear in these models as differently and often not adequately religious. Their failures to play the game of religious competition, however, is not ever viewed as a failure of the scope of the market to sustain a plurality of religions. No, it is rather usually cast as a failure of religions to cast off their religious peculiarities and to participate in the thriving religious commerce of modern democracies. This position and model has been criticized by many quarters since the time that it was first suggested in the 1980s. The statistical models used to support it have been routinely and roundly undercut. There are no data to support it. Others have been critical of the rational actor model that undergirds it. Yet others have argued that it places too little attention on cooperation rather than competition, and so on. None of these criticisms, however, have struck the death knell. This is, in fact, the literature and the theory that is the most widely circulated and cited outside the field of sociology, and it's the one that influences American public policy, one might argue as well. Despite all of these deficiencies, it remains a very strong and robust notion. This is largely, I would argue, because the critics of this, and all of us, I think, and to a certain extent, all share a similar position with these economic sociologists, that religious freedom is good, and that religious freedom is identified through religious pluralism, signaled by the presence of these multiple religious actors. This claim to freedom and pluralism consistently takes attention away from the regulatory structures and frameworks and the social norms that shape and position various religious actors and has its own naturalizing effects. The strongest critics of the religious economies models are the sociological neo-institutionalists, and we'll take them as an example. These scholars study organizations as they cooperate and compete in various fields. For example, education, religion, health, law, all of these are organizational fields which they study. Institutional models demonstrate that all organizational fields have explicit and implicit norms that are consistent with their own internal workings, and norms of participation. Some of these regulations and norms are legal, others are cultural habits, others are rituals, and so on. New entrants, new organizational entrants into any of these fields must conform to the rules that are already on the ground or find ways to innovate but still pay some kind of attention to them. Thus, normative, legal, and mimetic pressures all work to shape, if we would talk about religion, they all work to shape religious groups that might be otherwise marginal or new and reshape them and recast them in terms of the norm. And this, in fact, is a way that various actors become legitimate religious actors. So sociologists have argued Hindu temples become not-for-profit congregations and take on new governance structures when they are transplanted to North America. Muslims in the United States and Canada begin to build chaplaincy programs or religious day schools to establish familiar forms of pastoral care or educational interests and so on. And in so doing, they gain legitimacy. The organizational perspective would seem to counter a free religious market model in the way that it calls attention to these varieties of norms. And in many respects, it does. In particular, it does seem to challenge the claim that religions are more free in a religious marketplace because this marketplace is unregulated. But surprisingly, these models largely do not challenge this unregulated model. Instead, or they do so in a very peculiar way. Instead, sociologists working in this frame argue that by conforming or submitting to religious freedoms found in pluralistic democracies, religions, in fact, become better, more authentic versions of themselves. So while these religious groups might submit in new contexts, they are nonetheless becoming more free and thereby more religious. Despite ample evidence around the globe that troubles this notion in any number of ways, sociologists in the US have argued that the norms of the free public sphere places demands on religious groups to become these better versions of themselves. One prominent sociologist and a strong critic of the free market model nonetheless states that in countries such as the US, where religious groups carry on, quote, without state regulation or state support, and, quote, without state authorities to enforce orthodoxy, that each group's attempt to create a more nearly perfect spiritual community was free to find its own fertile soil or perish. She continues, each group could embody its religious impulses in the pragmatic organizations that the American experiment made possible. It was a system born of the Protestant impulse, but nurtured in a pragmatic and pluralist democracy of the United States. And as she continues, some non-Protestant traditions have complained that they have been Protestantized, as they have accommodated to American culture. But she says, whatever else this has meant, they are right that they have been pushed to adopt a basic commitment to live peacefully alongside religious others. In other words, they are being forced to be free. Here we confront a more powerful vision of religious freedom that links both free market proponents and their critics, a powerful political discourse wherein religions become better versions of themselves when separated from the state regulation or support. Religious pluralism can continue to expand past its initial Christian base, but only insofar as other religions are willingly submitting to the structural and theological transformations within modern democratic societies. Several things are striking to me about this and about the shared language of religious freedom that cuts across both the religious economies models and its critics. First, I'm struck by the way that the index and markers of religious freedom have become so tied to groups rather than to individuals. Religious freedoms mean the possibility of seeing and observing and marking a variety of religious groups, either competing or cooperating. And religious pluralism, in contrast to this earlier period of the 1950s, is not identified as an experience of the individual confronting other religiously plural individuals, but rather a variety of clearly identified religious groups competing or cooperating with each other. This shift in attention to religious firms as the site in the index of religious freedom has a range of implications, and I think we can see some of this already at light in the current American discourse about contraception. For example, this recent arguments about freedom of religion deals not with the freedom of religions of individuals, but rather the freedom of the Catholic Church as a firm. This case, I think, is the freedom of the Catholic Church to distinguish itself from other religious competitors, if we put it in the economics model. So the shift from individuals to firms as being a location where one marks religious freedom is a curious one. Second, it is surprising to me how much of this language shares, despite its emphasis on firms, with classical liberal political theory. It is this theoretical tradition to which current frameworks of religious pluralism owe an enormous amount, more in fact than to Durkheim or Weber. Yet this literature, this political theory literature, is absent in most current discussions of religious pluralism, adding, I believe, to the further naturalization of our vision of religious freedom and plurality. With this in mind, I believe that there is a lot that we can gain in this moment by looking anew at this more antique political literature that has sustained a shifting set of stories about religious pluralities, including rights, religious or property rights, and modern democracies. In doing so, we can begin to untangle, perhaps, the ways that democracy, religion, and free markets have been linked under this illusory rule of naturalized human freedom. We could, for example, and I'll just give two quick examples because, well, there's no time, and these are very interesting things to me. I hope they will be to you too. But we could, for example, just return to and reread what most consider to be the ore text of Religious Freedom and Liberal States, John Locke's letter concerning toleration. This much heralded 1689 text identified citizens' religious rights of conscience and worship over which the magistrate would hold no legitimate sway. Locke argues, and he argues at remove from England. He's sitting in Amsterdam as he writes this. He argues that religious toleration towards others is both a condition of and as a sign of good policy. Polity, rather. And here we find that we share much with him, at least in the broad strokes. The presence of multiple religious beliefs and operating toleration are necessary for the harmonious functioning of society itself. The magistrate's meddling in religious affairs creates more harm than any religious group would on its own. A tolerated plurality will cultivate better citizens as each man can find comfort in the religious home that suits his conscience best. This will increase religious vitality, religious sentiment, and lead to better, more morally guided citizens. The magistrate, one imagines, will be less needed in the future to take care of men's moralities as private religious sentiment can be newly cultivated in this plural context. It is with this last concept in mind that Locke likewise makes a forceful argument for pluralism's limits. He writes, quote, "Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of humane society, can have no hold upon the atheist. And likewise, Catholics and Mohammedans are also to be excluded from this polity as their religious beliefs, quote, deliver them up to the protection and services of another prince. Atheists can have no bond to the state as they do not exercise a moral code. Catholics and Muslims also have no true bond to the state as they serve another master. Both, in fact, can be viewed as enemies of the state in which religious toleration flourishes." Of course, we now extend the notion of religious rights and freedoms a bit further than this, but the logics of Locke's limitations remain with us. Indeed, they reemerge in new ways with the resuscitation of this new pluralistic thinking. Stronger claims are being made now than in the recent past by scholars that religion is voluntary, but that at the same time, voluntary religion and its multiplicities and freedoms is not marked by variations in an individual's religious predilections in private life, but rather this flourishing of multiple religions in public. The goods of religion we see are dependent not only for their flourishing, but on their clear, self-evident differentiation from the political. We might likewise reconsider Jean-Jacques Rousseau's language of civil religion as a perhaps surprisingly related investigation of how religion, so disconnected and pure, might nonetheless continue to lay the groundwork for society's shared moral codes. No lover of diversity, Rousseau, contra Locke, also rejects the notion of natural rights to property and religion. These rights, these concepts, develop only within society itself, as he writes in the Proto-Constructivist on the social contract. Despite Rousseau's distaste for natural law and natural rights, the language of both reemerge clearly in the penultimate chapter of this book, titled On Civil Religion. In this odd little chapter, Rousseau argues that a good society necessarily supports its citizens' real religious aspirations, and in doing so, those citizens necessarily serve to uphold the state. Religion is, quote, of great importance that each citizen have a religion that cause him to love his duties. This will connect him to the state, its rituals, and will make him love and abide by its demands. This is pure, free individual religion. It is decidedly not Catholicism, which he deems nonsense because it again divides men's loyalties between the Pope and the secular sovereign. Protestantism, likewise, is worthless. You have to sort of read between the lines, the Man of Geneva. But it is also worthless because true Christians care only about the sovereign of the heavens and the life to come, and cannot be counted on to perform their earthly duties to other men either. Islam and Lamaism appear to be better ideas for him, except that they are, quote, based on errors and lies, making citizens credulous and superstitious. Rousseau, the man who refuses natural rights, then asserts in clear Enlightenment prose that what Christianity has historically made possible is the rediscovery, or in fact the new discovery, of the individual moral compass or human sentiment within each person. This spiritual sentiment, Rousseau makes a strong case for in Emile, where he says true religion is written on the good and great book of nature. There is no excuse for not reading this book, Rousseau writes, for it speaks to all in the language they can understand. Of course, the capacity to read such a book is dependent on the society in which one lives, much as private property led to individual slavery, wars, and horrors, but also enabled humans to claw their way to a more enlightened and reasonable free state of the social contract. So religion follows suit, from theocracy to various unenlightened and noxious mixings of religion and politics to religious truth itself. Modern society, modern democratic society, makes true religion, apolitical religion, uniquely possible. We could go on, of course, with Smith and Mill, who have interesting things to say about religion and property, sentiment and identity, or others of this type who hover spectrally over our current shifting understandings of religious freedom and religious pluralism. The recent turn or return to a free market model creates, I think, an urgency to do so. For after all, the naturalization of religious freedom and religious plurality is a fact in our world. It was Marx who wryly noted that the privatization of religious identity does not mean that religious identity ceases to be a matter of consequence, just as the act of privatizing property does not transform property into something that the state has no interest in, so the privatization of religion does not make it free to be left to its own devices. Making religion private shifts it to civil society, where it, much like property, becomes a new site for the capacity of social and political distinction. Repeating positive affirmations that religious pluralities are models of and models for religious freedom does not make it so. Likewise, positing that the natural state of religious freedom is discovered in the political context where rights language asserts itself does not make regulation go away. But the allure of this new pluralist thinking is very strong, especially as it, much like the positive thinking of Norman Vincent Peale, helps to hide the mechanisms by which we recognize religions as free or as many, as well as the reasons why we find those evaluations useful or necessary or even nice. To sum up then, the powers of pluralist thinking that currently hold sway are both old and new. This new thinking is shifted from a pluralism as contributing to the declining role of religion within the secular state, and thus supporting the development of individual pursuits against the powers and authorities of divisive and non-rational religious entities, the old one, to a pluralism contributing to the continued vitality of religious forms within the secular state, which comes to stand as a singular marker of a state's commitments to ensuring freedoms of all kinds. The underlying shift that we have seen, I think, is one where religious pluralism has been refashioned within the logic of a market economy, where state regulation is seen as a problem, except insofar as it keeps inappropriate actors from participating or helping new firms or actors to join the market. We've also seen that regulation appears to have a positive recuperative role in this regard, insofar as it assists and trains religious groups and individuals how to be better religions. That is, it trains them to be free religions, to cast off the cultural baggage or problematic ties to other parts of social life. Early on in this talk, I suggested that the turning point in the 1970s could have taken social scientists in several different directions. They could have taken what they were observing as this blow up of their secularization theories and chosen other possible approaches to consider the religious and political worlds that we confront. To suggest one path not taken, recall that I said that both pluralization and differentiation were key aspects of secularization theories. Current views of pluralism have revised and reshaped earlier understandings of the effects of pluralization, but they have held tightly, and in fact ever more tightly, onto this modern vision of social differentiation, and thereby religion's distinction and privatization from other sectors of public life. For religions to be free, they must be differentiated from politics and the economy. They must not depend upon or make demands of the state to flourish or to continue. What would have happened if in the 1970s sociologists had started to question not the problematic logic of pluralization on its own, but also the more deeply embedded and naturalized view of religion as differentiated and distinct from other parts of social life? My suspicion is that this would have taken them and us down a quite different path. Without the object of pure religion to draw upon as a constant or even as an ideal, without the rational religious actor, without a religious citizen whose true religious aspirations are finally emergent in free civil society, we would have a very different way of thinking about religious pluralism. We would not, I hazard to guess, have yet taken off the powers of pluralist thinking that it has and its hold that it has over us. But we might be in a better position to speak about the consequences of the legacies of these magical and enduring concepts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And we have some time for questions and for comments. Thank you for taking us through the relationships and development of sociological thinking about pluralism, bringing us into conversation with political theory, with economic theory. A lovely and rich presentation, so thank you. Now, I'm holding this microphone so that we can capture it for posterity, so I'll pass this around as you have questions or comments for Professor Bender, and we have another microphone as well. So over to you. Anyone with questions, thoughts for Professor Bender?
Thanks. So let me start by saying that I'm not a law and religion person, and so my interest in religion is that of an outsider, and perhaps my question will therefore reflect my own interest. So here's one thought that I've been kind of thinking about in the different contexts, and some of what you said made me think about it, and you tell me if it has anything to do with the change that you described. So. Could it be that the change that you described may reflect a change in the decline of a Republican conception of freedom and republicanism and the rise of a liberal conception of freedom, by which I mean the Republican idea is one of freedom as citizenship, and you said something very much along those lines, and to the idea of liberty as freedom as being on your own, and being left alone, and in fact you could see perhaps the rise of the freedom to choose. The economic freedom is only one facet of that broader conception, and and therefore, to the extent that you see this shift, that perhaps that's part of the story that's going on there. And another thing is perhaps, and again, it may reflect my own perceptions or interest in this topic. So perhaps one reason that in the United States, at least since the 1960s, there was a shift towards more a new conception of religious plurality or pluralism is because there was an enemy, and the enemy was atheism, which from the 50s was associated with communism, part of the Cold War, and more recently perhaps the rise of what they call new atheism. And so, and this has kind of led perhaps religious groups to stop fighting among themselves and see themselves as, we're just competing on, in one sense, we're competing on the market, but we're also all in this together against the other.
Right,
yes.
right. No, I think that, I thank you for I think that first on the first point, that the sort of broader shift from, or the range of ways that there are shifts in American sort of conceptions of liberty in this period, I think, marking from republicanism to liberalism, definitely the case. I think that my interest here is actually sort of the larger interest, I think, is really thinking about the ways that Americans in particular think about the economy and markets, and also think about religion. But this, of course, is the sort of reach of this. I'm sort of get scared when I start thinking about how far this might go, because I hate the sort of hegemonic arguments of like everything's changed. And, so to keep it small is but I think it's fantastic to sort of think about the reverberating changes that are also going on in this time. Certainly so. I think the question about what's changed in American religion and the other, the sort of this other who's always been out there. I mean, it has not always actually been out there. So the problem of the atheist in the U.S. Right, in the 1950s, the communist was the other. So, Eisenhower famously said, we all have a religion and I don't care which one it is, 1952. This is, you just have one, right? So this is the Protestant Catholic Jew sort of version of this. And atheists don't go away, certainly in this later period, but they take on a different position. And I don't think that they necessarily take on the position that allows all of these religious groups to say, we are in this together against something called the symbolic atheist. In fact, after the Cold War, atheism doesn't surface in religious discussions as much then the other who comes up is the Muslim or the other varieties of others, these religious others that are very scary and in the more recent context. So but I think that this question of the sort of symbolic other is important. In the US, as you probably all know, only 2% of Americans will cop to being atheists. So even though there are larger numbers of Americans over the last 20 years who now say that they have no religious preference at all, they won't say they're Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. They'll just say we're none. A large majority of them nonetheless say that they believe in God, which I think actually suggests the power of belonging and the sort of marking, not so much that the atheist is the scary other, but in fact that being American means being religious, because that is the first freedom of all of these others. So to reject that is in fact to reject your capacity to be an American. Right, that's an American story.
I was intrigued by your account of the Chicago School's theory of religious organization, but it made me think as well. I've read some analyses somewhere that one possible reason for increased adherence and to particular groups rather than to a generalized notion of religious freedom from the 1970s on has to do with the declining real income of middle Americans since that period, and the fact that churches are so important in providing social assistance as you fall down that ladder, that therefore it would seem to give a market-driven, non-market role for religious groups.
Right, I think, so there was a lot in there. One thing just to say that it's been striking that I can't give you the citation now, but several recent papers have demonstrated that least likely people to be participants in religious organizations in the US are the very poor. So a sort of maximum, to say, and this is for a variety of reasons, I think we can say, in one sense it's access issues, but there's, so yes, many Americans, so that's one thing to say, there's not a clear sort of economic driver of participation that's changed at the lowest end. And so, then, I think that there are varieties of ways compensation is very important. The other thing, though, to say, and this is where I would sort of take issue with some of the stories that, or the narratives and the data that sociologists use to talk about religious participation, is that I think that it's not all that clear that Americans are more, they're participating more in congregational religion than they did in earlier times. I think that there's shifting denominational allegiances, and there might be sort of an increased fervor for some small subset, but in terms of actual participation on a weekly basis, we probably see this declining, sort of continuing a decline from the 1950s. So, so what we see, in fact, are shifts in allegiance, right? And we do see shifts in the kinds of religious groups that have more adherents and less, right? So, and this would actually contribute to a certain kind of quasi, very minor sort of religious economies model, certainly, but right. So anyway, it's a very good question. Thank you.
I just want to describe a situation and see how this analysis would apply.
Okay, good. That's perfect.
If that's possible.
Yeah.
And I say this, again, without having thought of this question in that sense of the marketplace, or as religion as firms. Rather, they may compete in the marketplace of ideas or whatever. So pretty unsophisticated notion, from my point, I mean. So I'm thinking about the situation in Canada at the moment, and I think this is an accurate description. People can challenge it. You have some denominations which clearly separate themselves from the state, and issues arise, and you have to figure out how that's going to be worked out, and we've had those cases. And then you have religions that are divided, in particular between those who are trying to integrate with the state, trying to work with the state, and then the fundamentalist branch, which may also actually be trying to participate in the state, but holds much stronger views, views that may come into conflict quite strenuously with, if we can call them, predominant views of how society should be organized. So where we're facing this now, of course, is with Muslim and Islamic religion. So you have a situation where, because of many different reasons, those who are holding very strong Muslim beliefs come into conflict with the state. This is exacerbated by the fact that there is now a history from 2001 which has dissipated somewhat, I think, but not entirely. It's always behind there that this is definitely other. These are people who, are threats. These are people who are dangerous on many levels. Then you have the other, probably majority group, who make every effort they can to show that they're aligned with the state. To the extent sometimes of saying we don't agree with those fundamentalist views, that people shouldn't even be doing that. So we have that very much, I think, in Canada. And I'm wondering the extent to which, looking at these in the marketplace, where it becomes harder for people who hold stronger views to hold them because they're demonized in some way, and I don't think it's all demonizing. I say that from a personal view. And the others who make every effort to show they are part of the majority workplace in a way. They just hold some different kinds of views and can participate in helping to organize that broader society. So how does this kind of analysis play out with that dynamic?
Right. Well, thinking about, and I'm sorry, I don't really know the specifics of the Canadian cases, right? But I think, so I would say, I mean, to be clear, I don't think that this economies model works very well as actually describing what's happening on the ground, right? I think that actually sort of religions, I mean, to say, you know, there isn't a religious group in the US that doesn't have some kind of interaction with something called the state at some level. This is just a lie, right? This is, I mean, it is. Whether that means, you know, it has to deal with like zoning laws and regulations, or whether it means that it's actually working with the state to provide social services, or any of these things, right? And I think that's the same in Canada, right? So, but at the same time, you have this very strong political discourse that is marking different kinds of religions in relation to state actions, right? So that some religions are outside of the sphere of don't need the state. Right, they don't need the state. I mean, they do all these things, right? But in terms of their legitimacy, in terms of, you know, needing to be surveilled, all of these things, they don't need it. They are religious. They don't have. And then there are these others that appear to be, in this discourse, appear to be abnormally religious or abnormally related to the state as religions. And so then this provides two options, really. I mean, there are many, I guess one could imagine, but two basic options for religious groups, Muslims, Muslim groups, Hindu groups, you know what, even Christian groups in the United States, right? That is either to say we are American, we're going to conform to this free market kind of model and imagine ourselves in that way, right? Which has certain kinds of consequences for what they do, or they do go a route that's more, you know, to engage with the state, to say, you know, we do have rights that are not being protected, we do have interests that the state needs to help us to work out or protect, and so on. So that's the space in which religious groups are actually, I think, finding themselves, and it's not because some religious groups are regulated and others are not, but just because legitimacy is bound up, a sort of public legitimacy for religious groups is bound up in whether in varieties of ways of how these groups can position themselves. And not every single one has the capacity to be in any one of these places. That's the other thing, right? You can't, the idea that you know, a fundamentalist Christian group can choose more readily how it's going to pursue its legitimacy in public.
But I guess my question really is how, because I think that's right. I mean, that's a description of what happens. How does this notion of looking at religion as part of an economic model, how does the economic model illuminate that beyond understanding that as a political dynamic?
The economic model doesn't illuminate this at all. I mean, the economic model, I mean, is not a very good, I don't think it's a very useful one. I think what it does is it actually determines that there are religious groups that haven't yet sort of made their way into freedom, frankly. That's what they say. So that's not they haven't made their way into being able to work in the free market. I don't think it's a very helpful model, but it's one that is deployed politically all the time and sociologically.
Thanks. I wonder if you can reflect a little bit more on what you were saying close to the end about property rights and whether property rights are particularly useful, either analog or a way to think about how the notion of what you said at the end, that to be religious is you need to be able to be religious to be an American. Do you also need to be able to think about property as a thing that is real, that real estate is real to be an American? Because as we all know, the idea that people own certain parcels of land is an idea that came with Christianity to the Americas in a very particular way. So.
Right. No, I think that's, I mean, thank you for the question. I think that the answer to that is that that's exactly where I'd like to be thinking next. And so to read the Letter on Toleration with the Second Treatise of Government, to read Theory of Moral Sentiments with the Wealth of Nations in a way that looks at the ways that these, I mean, we usually think about all of these writers as being either political writers or religious writers. We sort of read their material on property and their material on religion as sort of parts of two different discourses instead of linking them together. And we see that all through liberal thought, actually, when you start to think about it, that all of these writers have written on both, and that there are resonant ideas that go back and forth. And I don't think it's been much, I mean, maybe you can tell me where I'm missing the literature, but I don't think that this has actually been explored very much. Whom?
On Locke. Jeremy Waldron was written on
Waldron, right, okay. On
Locke, that he says you can't understand his political theory outside of his religion.
his religion, right. So, but, right, but to take that the next step and say what he does say about religion and right, no. So, good, but I will definitely look at his stuff. And, right, but that's the next step. I do think there's a lot to be said there, but I can't say it yet.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you to comment a little bit more on the role of equality, the interrelationship between freedom and equality. 'Cause it seems to me that in a lot of the early literature, and certainly in a lot of jurisprudence from even mid-century, when the courts here are considering religion, they seem to be considering religion not as a manifestation of individual freedom, but rather as some sort of social force, an institution maybe, that is itself deserving of protection, of freedom. And you see this principle, I think it's the pluralism you're talking about, of the equality of religions. And then we see over the years this equality of religions kind of morphing into a sort of individual right, not only to be free, but also to be able to positively engage and be accommodated. And you have anti-discrimination language that seems to be the dovetailing of this freedom and equality, these two dimensions of religious activity. And it also intersects the group and the individual, because equality analysis necessitates consideration of the group.
Right. No, I think that's really, here's where I wish I had more to say, because one of the things that, I guess the question is, where is the space of equality? Is it before the law? Is it within this, some kind of social reality, whether it's a marketplace or whatever it is, right? What's the sort of, so the equality of the group or the equality of the individual, right? What sort of space is that being enacted or mobilized? I mean, you're speaking from a legal context, and also from, but I think that is one of the things that intrigues me in a sort of not so pleasant way about the religious economies models, if you actually do take it to the Chicago school sort of fulcrum, is that there's, equality is not natural. Equality, that is not something, distributive justice and all these things are things that the state does that actually ruins, the full functioning of this, perfect, natural, free market, which, right, so, and if you take that into the religious economies model, you see that this is actually also circulating in their concept of what, this is a little farther away from where you're going, but that really religions are not equal. They are not equally able to be free. They are not, so they do not, and in fact it's at that point where they then become of interest to the state, the law, and then the law is maybe pushing too much. So that's really the sort of political back end of this model that I find so troubling. And that's one piece, and of course all of these other arguments are going on at the same time. We see, even in American jurisprudence, these arguments about, many cases where you see similar kind of questions about whether you can have religious freedom without protecting the groups and so on. So, right. So, not a very good answer. Go ahead.
It seems to come down really to the question of whether religion has any inherent value.
It does.
And whether the state should, as a matter of public policy.
Right. I would say that we've gone very long time thinking that it does. Just sort of, we say that it does, or that, because people have this thing that's called religion that they should have some right to, right? So that seems to me that it just has some value that's there, and it's actually marked in a particular way, that it's religion and it's not religion and politics, it's not religion and something else. It is something called religion. I think we've gone a long time thinking that way, and I think that the whole logic of this differentiated religion that actually can be identified as something that's not these other things just doesn't hold up historically or sociologically. So, what is the implication then for, for us? From that, I think that is really the big question. And here I'm a sociologist, and I'll say, have fun. So.
It's time for one or two more questions. I just want to maybe shoot myself into it just with a question, Courtney. I wonder if you could link this up, and I just have this intuition that there's a strong relationship to a story that you can tell about the development about pluralist thought and a change in the way that identity gets talked about, the way that identity is put together as a political conversation, whether or not there's actually some kind of linking up or tethering between a change in thinking about pluralism and a change in thinking about forms of identity. I take it from what you're saying that there is some sort of a link there. That
yeah, but I also think it's very complicated, and here's where it's complicated to the degree that I think that I need to think more about this. So, because at the same time, I think that we see the strengthening of this focus on firms and identity with our pluralistic forms of religion, where we can identify as religious. At the same time, in the American context, you have, as I've mentioned, this decline in actual identification with actual religious traditions, right? So you have a growing number of people who say they're spiritual, not religious, who remain nominally religious but not tied to any particular religious tradition. Interestingly, this has happened actually, this switch has taken place since the early 1990s. So, from the early 1990s till now, you see a decline of about 14% of the American population who will identify with a religious tradition. And the sociologists who have talked about this say that the main reason for this opting out is that these are people who are not pleased with the politicization of religious groups with which they were formerly involved with, right? So religious identity actually has come to mean something more specific in the United States, I would say. And at the same time, we see more people opting out of that specificity and that sort of determining marker of identity. At the same time, they're remaining spiritual or something that's, most of them, they're not atheists. No more atheists in the US than there used to be. So this is, yes, continue.
So yeah, just linking that to the question in a sense that Danny asked at the beginning, I wonder, are you willing to or can you draw a link between a different way of pluralist thinking and models of secularism? I mean, is there some kind of a relationship between a shift in a sense of how you imagine pluralism and a change in the configuration of the secular? And specifically, I'm thinking here different polities that take on different senses of what the secular is.
Absolutely.
Is that rooted in a different sense of what pluralism entails?
Yes, I think so. I guess I won't say, I'm not sure how you would want me to elaborate on that, except to say that I do think that that these, I mean, if we think about secularism as being connected to particular kinds of national identity, there are different kinds of secularism that develop in certain kinds of national contexts, then we would expect a plurality of pluralist ways of pluralist thinking that would be very tied into the ways that particular sort of forms of regulation are managing these pluralities, right? So I think that, but I mean, I would say, at least coming from my American context, that the language of freedom is sort of so overwhelming in this that it's very difficult to get a handle on what the regulatory shape of pluralism is, even to begin with in the US where I am, right? So it might be a lot easier to see somewhere else. Or on the other hand, I mean, many people, including Winnie Sullivan, who was here last month, argue that this American style of pluralism is, rapidly expanding and being exported around the world in varieties of policy programs and other kinds of non-governmental organizational programs and so on. So who knows? It's this big creeping thing. Sorry, Dan, I'm gonna punt the secularism question.
Any other final questions, comments people would like to make? I take that last response, by the way, Courtney, as an invitation to think a little bit about the moves in ways of thinking about pluralism within national traditions as well,
Yes,
to try
absolutely.
and trace those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
And I take what you've given as a wonderful offer of that kind of a genealogy of thinking in pluralism and how it links up to particular questions of religious freedom, religious regulation, religious identity. And so as I give her a plaque of her poster for today and a gift, I hope you'll join me in thanking Courtney Bender for